Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you all. I know people are getting seated. It's so exciting to see so many familiar faces and new faces. My name is Alison Beyea. I'm the Executive Director at the Goldfarb Center, and I'm delighted to have you at the last of our 4 installments of In the News. It's been a great time, and hope you've enjoyed as well. So for our last conversation, we're thrilled to be joined here by Colin Woodard. Colin, there's many things that make Colin interesting. First, but not foremost, is he's from Maine. So he lives here in Maine and has been a huge part of our journalist scene in Maine. Has covered some of the most important stories in the Press Herald. Someone I've read throughout maybe not my entire career, not that old, but a lot of incredibly important reporting. But he's also has a very big national presence. His most recent book, and some of you may have heard of it, is Union, which I have to read the full, we love the colon, right?
Long
Union,
subtitles,
the struggle to forge the story of the United States nationhood. And that may come up a little bit tonight, but we're actually here to talk about a different topic, so we'll get to that in a minute. But Colin he's a best-selling author. He's written for the New York Times, for Politico. I mean, I don't know. Is there any paper you haven't written for? Probably not.
There's got to be a bunch.
Okay, well, it's
not that many times in each one.
Not that many times. But even though he's still reporting, he right now is he is the director of the Nationhood Lab at the Pell Center for International Relations and Public Affairs, which is at Salve Regina University, which is down in Rhode Island. So he's won a lot of awards. He's done all kinds of things that we're so excited that he's going to bring this knowledge with us today. So
thank you.
Welcome, Colin.
Pleasure.
And we also have on stage with us Grace Hillis. Grace is class of 24, meaning she's about to graduate. She's an econ major and a math major, and she's on the executive board of the Goldfarb Center. So we're really happy that you are here as well.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to do it the sort of same way. We're going to ask a couple of questions, and then we're going to jump right into what's on your mind and what's coming up for you in our conversation. So we have the microphone there, and we, I think, have enough sugar that you should be awake enough to get excited and get into the conversation. But let's tee it off. So we titled, the title of your talk today is, I also have to look and read because it was fairly long. Is the US media up to the task of covering domestic authoritarianism? So my question to you is, we're in this really heated and divisive time in politics. Is this really that different? I mean, should we really be calling this authoritarianism? That's how you describe it. But aren't we just seeing partisan politics in its most newest iteration with, faster media, AI, disinformation? Like, is this really that different, or is it just what we've been seeing with a new face?
Yeah, it's quite a bit different. I mean, I'd say that we don't have any precedents like this since the late 1850s, and that didn't end so well. I mean, think about it if it were in another country. You have the outgoing president decides that he is not going to honor the results of the election based on no evidence at all, and then gets a mob to violently try to sack the seat of government in order to stay in power, and the mob says that they're trying to kill his own vice president, along with other key figures. And then thereafter, the political party he belongs to, instead of casting him out, ends up embracing him. He becomes the nominee for president again, despite being under 90-something indictments in both state and federal court. And what is his program? You don't have to ask, is this an authoritarian danger? President Trump is telling us that he is. He said what he wants to do. He's going to use the Insurrection Act to allow him to deploy the military in domestic law enforcement duties and to break up protests he doesn't like. That he's going to stack the civil service with political appointees for the first time in a century or so that the civil servants themselves would be chosen for their political loyalty to a particular agenda. That he's going to pardon those who have already been convicted of crimes related to January 6th and other things. In other words, the very people who tried to cause him to hold on to power despite losing an election. The threats to mass deport people and to set up deportation centers and stuff. I mean, this is exactly the sort of agenda that you see in authoritarian states. And I was a foreign correspondent covering those kind of places. This is the exact playbook, including the demonizing of the media and the rest. So no, the threat of an actual collapse of democracy in the country is in fact possible, right? And that would be attended in our particular constitutional and federal arrangements, the likelihood of political violence or even a civil conflict is actually there. I actually don't think any of those things are going to happen, but the possibilities, 30%, and because of the consequences, that's not something one can ignore. And it's taken us a while to get to this authoritarian moment, but we're not in normal waters at all, and these are not, a regular election involving two political parties operating within the normal democratic tradition and arguing over which way are the best policies to further the American experiment. It's like one is still doing that for all of its flaws, and the other one is turning its back on the American experiment, including the idea that there'll be peaceful transitions of power and that the people, rather than the machinations of a regime, will decide who's going to be leading the country next.
Okay, I have like a million follow-ups, but I'm gonna
I do too.
Okay, where do you want to jump in?
So you have laid it out really clear for us. This is not traditional politics. This is not what we have seen in previous elections. So given that we're in such a different political environment that we found ourselves in before, what new challenges does this pose to the media? You mentioned one, attacks against the media, but are there more we should look out for?
Yeah, well, I mean, the US media, as this sort of authoritarian movement was building, 2015, 2016, was woefully unprepared for the moment. And now, they're sort of getting it, but they're way behind the curve. And it's because the norms of American journalism developed at a time when this was not the case, when we have a system that causes us to eventually always have two dominant parties, and there was always this choice between two parties operating within the same parameters of political and democratic norms, and the whole framework of post-war American journalism was based on that you go and see what each side is saying and present them both to the public, and the public can make some kind of decision that they're both honest actors operating within their own opinion sets. When you're dealing with an actual authoritarian movement, that's not what's going on, right? To pretend that the two are neutral when all of the data you start collecting is suggesting that one is actually a threat to the American system itself and is telling you it is, and the other is, again, for its own flaws, is still operating more or less in the old, post-war consensus operation in politics. That's a problem. It's a problem to, journalism can't stand around trying to be balanced, right? That's not the mission. The mission is to use objective methodology to find the truth and share it with the citizenry, right? Because in our system, the citizenry are sovereign, right? And in order for citizens to act in their sovereign capacity, they need to be informed. So the press's role is to do that. And it's really uncomfortable for the press when the data you're collecting is all making one side in a Coke-Pepsi contest looking bad most of the time, but that's where the data's going. The press hates that, right? They can't wait to find something that they can even up the sides or even prop up something that's not equal in order to do it. That's how deeply ingrained the idea of neutrality and balance are. But that's not it. Use objective methodology like a scientist. You objectively gather the evidence from every possible source in a balanced and fair way, right? You're trying to grab the entire landscape and experiment and figure out what's going on in good faith and figure out the evidence. If the evidence tells you, and you can establish as proof that X is happening, and X is really important, you say X is happening. And you don't spin it or undermine it. It's X. Here it is. Here's the math of the proof. That's the job of the press. And there's been this sort of sense that, no, the job of the press is somehow not that, because X looks really bad to the other side, and well, we got to find something equally bad on it. No, you don't if it's not there, right? You're doing a disservice to the truth and therefore to the whole role of a press in democratic society, and inadvertently helping undermine this. And remember, everything I'm saying is all about the sort of what's now called the mainstream press, which I would define as those operating within, or where the goal is to operate within these objective kind of norms. There's a whole another conversation we can have about the disinformation cycle and the sort of, various apparatuses that have grown lately that aren't committed to that kind of journalism, which complicate things. But yeah, so it's been a slow process and frustrating. I'm a former foreign correspondent. I was, I spent my exchange program I'm of the age where my junior year abroad was 1989, and I was studying Eastern Europe and the Balkans, so I was in Eastern Europe at the Karl Marx University of Economic Sciences in Budapest when communism collapsed. I was there for that. I was like, this is amazing. I got to come back the next summer. I got to come back as soon as I graduate and stay. And I became a foreign correspondent covering that region. And that was a place where everything was unstable, where dictatorships were collapsing in all these places, and people had to reinvent themselves, their country, figure out how to build a liberal democracy from scratch when one had never existed, or it hadn't existed since the 1930s, which in Europe had its own complications. And some of them didn't go that way. Some devolved into fascist regimes like Franjo Tudjman's Croatia. Hungary, where I lived for a lot of that time, is now run by Viktor Orban, who's a hardcore authoritarian and driving the country further and further from democratic norms in the European Union. What I'm saying is, all the warning signs of that to those of us who had lived in places where democracy had backslid, all the warning signs were there in 2016. We've just seen after January 6th and what's happened since, just how far down the road we've gone. So yeah, it's not a normal moment, and the press corps is getting it, but they're still behind the wave and the curve in this country because they grew up in a complacent time when, they thought it couldn't happen here for some reason.
I mean, I'm struck that, I'd be interested what you all think. I mean, it is, to hear you talk about it, it is hard for me not to feel like it is a partisan approach. Right? We are so used to this idea of equal time. There's a lot of law that is about equal time for candidates. And so, there was, right? And so, I mean, it is interesting for me to think about that, how much of our story of our country, right, this idea of what we think the press should be, influences what, when I hear you speak, I'm like, well, I mean, is that really what's happening? Is this really, isn't it, shouldn't we, is that, so I'm interested, maybe this is a moment before we go to questions. I had mentioned to you that Colin has written this book about how regional differences influence how we vote and how we think about the world. So I'd love, just give them a little primer on your theory of sort of how American statehood, and then let's open it up to questions and we'll see where we get in that conversation. And I'd love to hear what you all think about what Colin's saying. And is this resonating, or are you having that kind of question about what is the media supposed to do here?
I mean, I guess I'm like an interdisciplinary scholar who fell into journalism as a day job, but I was still doing the scholarship-y stuff and writing books the whole time I was a journalist. And one of them is that Alison mentioned is American Nations, History of the 11 Rival Regional Cultures of North America. And that book, which came out in 2011 and has had some splash and influence out there, argues essentially that you can't understand the United States, its history, its constitutional arrangements, its current politics, or anything else, unless you realize that it wasn't founded as one country. They were rival colonial projects, none of which thought that they were going to end up in a continent-spanning federation together, that formed on the eastern and southwestern rims of what's now the United States at different times, by people with different religious and political ideas and ideologies, sometimes belonging to different empires. Many of these were English, some were Dutch, some were Spanish, some were the French Empire, and coming into different parts of what's now the United States. And even the English ones were radically different. I mean, right, the New England cultural space and greater New England, stretching out across upstate New York, the Western Reserve, Ohio, and onward, started with the early Puritans, right? A bunch of English people who thought that they were in a covenant with God like the Old Testament Hebrews, and that they'd been tasked to go to the New England wilderness to do certain things in the world, and that they would be punished or rewarded collectively. Whoa, right? People with a mission, literally, and that they had to, through their public shared institutions, all that matters, they succeeded in creating what they thought to be this more holy place. But it meant that deep in the culture of New England, and not other regions of the country, is this notion that through collective institutions, you're trying to build and engineer a better society. And that when the needs of the community and of individual liberty come in conflict, you actually side with the community's needs, which is kind of un-American in other regional cultures where that would not be the case. Contrast that with another English culture that settled and colonized a different area at the same time. In the Chesapeake country, the leadership group were not Puritans. They were the lesser sons of the English manorial families, right? The Lord Granthams and Downton Abbeys of the late 1600s, who they were not the firstborn son who was going to inherit the estate, but the second and third and fourth and fifth-born sons, who normally would have been told, you got to go into the priesthood or maybe merchant class. There's nothing here for you. Get out of the house. Suddenly, the discovery of the New World meant you could actually go and create a new manorial estate. You could replicate the feudal system in the New World where there was land for the taking from their point of view. And so they went and did that, and the model in the Chesapeake country was to conservatively recreate what they left behind in the English countryside. Manorial estates, with peasants working the land that would send their surplus back to London. In the countryside, you sent it by wagon. In the Chesapeake country, you put it on a ship at your dock at your manor estate and sent it back to London. Often, you could get it to London just about as fast because wagon roads in England were really bad. That was the model, right? They couldn't find serfs in the end to do things. Nobody in the New World wanted to have the role of the peasants. They tried indentured servants, and when that didn't work, they turned to a model they saw being perfected in the West Indies, and they turned to a race-based slave culture. But fast forward, how else could you have ended up with Jefferson at Monticello, right? Or Mount Vernon and George Washington, or George Mason's estate? These are all manorial estates modeled in the English countryside. Inherently conservative and aristocratic society versus an English society set by a bunch of dissenting religious people who feared the formation of an aristocracy so much that they get freaked out that you would consolidate any power in any institution. Every town government has to be a little republic unto itself. Vassal borough, our own republic, right? Can't let the county have any power because they'll become a tyrant. I say all this because you could tell a story about each of these different rival cultures and their underlying ideologies, and through the 1830s, they each colonized an exclusive strip of our continent before there was significant in-migration from anywhere else. And you can see that map of the tectonic plates if you know the first settler settlement geography. This is via the cultural geographer Wilbur Zielinski's 1973 book on first settler effects. You can see it on the maps today at the county level. Political maps, COVID death rates, COVID vaccine rates, diabetes, lack of health insurance, gun violence per capita, life expectancy. That's all the work, part of the work we're doing at Nationhood Lab. We're doing data journalism. You can go to nationhoodlab.org and see all these maps of settler effects from 300 or 400 years ago, seeing it played out because the institutional and ideological baked-in landscape went with those colonizers for better or worse, and we face it today. So that affects politics and all kinds of other stuff.
And I imagine it'll infect this conversation. But let's see if anyone has a question right out. Audrey, come on up to the microphone, please.
Hello.
You want to say your name? And I think it's on.
Okay.
It's on.
I'm Audrey. I'm a sophomore here. Thank you so much for speaking with us. I'd love to pick your brain a little bit more about Viktor Orban and the international relations if Trump gets elected. He is friendly with Orban, and also in the greater context of the war in Ukraine and the rise of far-right challenger parties in Europe. How do you see the Trump presidency in the context of a greater trend towards authoritarianism?
Right, excellent question. The crisis in liberal democracies, small l, small d, is happening simultaneously around the world, but especially in Europe as well. A lot of the same markers and events, like the 2008 financial collapse, were triggered in various places and causing these kind of stresses. And there's a rise in authoritarianism in Hungary, and with Orbán Viktor, where I lived for a long time, Vladimir Putin's turning of Russia from an imperfect democracy into a dictatorship. And for a time, even in Poland and in other countries, the rise of the AfD party in Germany. There's all kinds of authoritarian threats out there. Europeans are really concerned with the advent of Russia's war against Ukraine, that were there to be a change in administrations and Donald Trump would come to power, that he would make good on all the things that Trump has promised to do. Withdraw from NATO, right? Give Ukraine nothing. He's obviously, Trump criticizes many things. Never once will you ever find Trump criticizing Vladimir Putin for some reason, right? And if the Europeans are concerned, and I think they are correct, that if Trump wins, the United States could in fact switch sides in a sense, would be backing Vladimir Putin, would certainly leave Ukraine to collapse, and without US aid, Ukraine would not succeed in its war, and I don't believe that if there weren't a NATO that you can count that Russia wouldn't proceed further, and that's the concern in the frontline European capitals, absolutely. Not Orban's Hungary, who's decided to to make authoritarian alliances with Putin, but in Poland and Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia and Moldova, they're absolutely concerned and they're absolutely right to be. And they're trying to decide, I was just actually doing a virtual event yesterday with a security think tank in Brussels had organized, where the audience were all European military thinkers, and their question for me and my fellow American academics they had on there was, should Europe be planning for a contingency where it has to stand alone? And my answer was yes. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen. I think the chance is only 20, 30%, but the consequences, if that 30% comes up on the roll, is too great for you not to be planning for that possible contingency. And you're always, as long as the Republican Party is in that state of alliance, like actually a majority of Republicans just a few days ago, contrary to their own speaker, voted against the aid package to Ukraine, right? That's where they stand at the moment. As long as that's the case, you're potentially one election away from the United States not having your back in Western Europe. And the Europeans have not prepared to stand on their own in their own defense in the face of an aggressive military threat, which now is not an abstract possibility. It's right there. So yeah, that's a great concern, and so he would align with Viktor Orban, absolutely, but more concern, he'd align with Vladimir Putin. And let me say, that living in Hungary, that Hungary would have a turn to the right didn't really surprise me. You could see that was a possibility in Hungary. We are a Finno-Ugric people surrounded by these, Indo-European people and an island, and they're all strangers, foreigners, and there's us, and they're so different, and that doesn't surprise me. The turn to be pro-Russian totally shocks me because, in the 90s, you couldn't speak Russian to a Hungarian person, even if they knew you were American. You didn't share a language because they hated Russia so much for the 1956 invasion, and which destroyed Budapest, and it was all pockmarked. And the last thing you could ever dream of would be a Budapest-Moscow alliance, but here we are.
Other questions? Can you mind coming to the microphone so people can hear? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Benjamin. I'm a first year. You talk about the 30% chance, and it sounds like your institute down at Salve Regina is very data focused. And I'm wondering, I can think of all these qualitative aspects of Trump that I can view as authoritarian, but I'm wondering about quantitative. Like, how do you get to that number? And what data points can you derive that are actually quantitative, have numbers behind them that get to 30%?
Yeah, we are pretty data-driven. The 20, 30% is my gut guess based on it's not based on data. That's just if I were betting today on the betting markets, I'd say there's a 70% chance that we make it through the cycle. But we do a lot of data stuff that's all surrounding that American nations things I described, and we do a lot of peer-reviewed academic cooperations in public health of all things, because public health researchers have long seen these strange geospatial differences in the US of the prevalence of all sorts of things: disability, sleep disorders, life expectancy, diabetes, inactivity, that match the settlement maps that we work with. And so we teamed up, and indeed it's true, there's enormous differences, and we're working towards explaining those. So that's the data side, but there's also the qualitative stuff we work on is primarily about how you solve for this, which is about finding and enhancing the glue that holds us together, and the right kind of, the good glue that holds us together around the best version of ourselves, which we can talk about a little bit further down the road.
But I think it's an interesting point. We think about, you opened your remarks, and then I want to make sure Grace gets in here. But you opened your remarks talking about all of the statements that the former Trump officials, Trump himself, are saying about what they would do. And is that really, the data, right? What is it really going to be? And so the question is that really an objective statement that you can say, this is what I'm saying, or is this just part of what campaigns do when they're talking about things? And if it is what you say, is it that people are just not as enamored with the democratic sort of process and are looking for a different model? We've had data that your generation is not as committed to sort of the democratic process that you are, not you, obviously, but that there have been some polling that suggests that authoritarianism doesn't necessarily sound as bad, right? Things work, things, certain things. So, how do we, is this really objectively, I feel like that's part of the question. What's the data that really says no, this isn't just Colin reporting that this is what I see. How do we know, and how do we trust that? And why is no one else believing that then?
Well, the 20 to 30% I thought was like the chance. That,
Right, no,
we're
I
going the
get
wrong
that,
way.
but I think back to your original point, it's just, right,
Yeah.
when I'm saying, wow, it's even hard for me to hear this,
Right? Well, check,
right? Is that just so we're so used to the idea that every idea is equally valid?
Go through an objective list of what authoritarianism is. I mean, pick your scholarship, go look at the academic literature from before Trump existed, so you know that it's not a Trump bias thing. Make a list of it, and then go down through and check the boxes. You'll find them all checked, I guarantee you, in not like supposing it, but actually you're being told by Trump or his closest lieutenants that that's the plan, or it already happened, right? So that's not really in doubt. I mean, it's hard for people to say it, and again, the press doesn't like coming out and saying it because the truth now that you can prove, and we all saw on television, sounds crazy, right? There was a coup attempt to overthrow the American government on January 6th. Sounds like a provocative statement, but it's just objectively true, right? Mm-hmm. So we ought to get used to saying it because there's, you're doing a disservice by hiding the truth about something that important. And I think a lot of people know that. I mean, it took January 6th to wake a lot of people up, but your mainstream state publications from the New York Times and the Atlantic and Washington Post all are basically agreeing that that's now what the stakes are, and so are, not Trump's enemies, Trump's former closest lieutenants and advisors in the White House are all coming out and warning that that's what's happening. His cabinet secretaries that he picked, right? This is not, a liberal cohort. Liz Cheney is no liberal. She's warning you what's coming, right? She's about as conservative as they get, but she's committed to the American democratic tradition, which we all should be. So, yeah, listen to those voices. Just skip the Democrats and the progressive. Just go to the people who serve most closely with Trump and his administration, see what they have to say. So, yeah, not only does it check all the boxes, but the voices that are saying it are compelling voices who know of what they speak.
So if January 6th, I guess, served as a pivot, and I think more people are waking up to the fact that this isn't normal politics, this is what an authoritarian right-wing regime looks like, has the media response changed in a way that's reassuring to you, or has the pivot not taken place in the media sphere?
I think the pivot started taking place after January 6th when I think they just couldn't believe that it had actually happened, and then they had to cope with it. But the pivot's late, like it's already sort of 4 or 5 years late, and is a little bit slow. So like I said, they're still kind of behind the curve. So I'm encouraged that it's moved to the right place, but it's kind of like climate change. It's like, yes, we're moving to the right place, but here's the graph of what you need to do, and this is kind of like that, right? So hopefully we improve the graph's flex. I think the media would need more time than between now and November to get it right, but it's, on its current banking, then by the time we have a presidential election 4.5 years from now, I think the media will know how to cover these sorts of things. And hopefully it won't be in the same space by then. But yeah, is it ready at the moment? No, it's still a work in progress, right? They're still trying to figure it out. Like NPR's having this whole, turmoil about how to cover things, and all the major outlets having to rethink, because it's violating the whole parameters of the way things used to work when this wasn't the world we were living in. But unfortunately it is.
What else is coming up? You got, jump on in. We're going to do 1, 2, and then 3, okay?
Hi, I'm Carter. I'm a first year. Thank you so much for being here. Based off of what you just said, I'm wondering if you think that Donald Trump, it's clear that you believe that he's an authoritarian and you have a lot of evidence to support it, but would you argue that the Republican Party is making a shift towards authoritarianism? Do you think there will be another Donald Trump? Say he loses this election, will there be another Donald Trump, or is this just a one-time thing? And if we make it through this election cycle and is there going to be another one? Is this going to happen again, or is this a one-time thing?
Right. I mean, I don't even think Donald Trump would say that he wasn't an authoritarian. I think he's owning it and embracing it, right? He's asked, Sean Hannity or somebody was trying to talk about, you're not really going to be the liberals are saying you're going to be a dictator. You're not going to be a dictator. Well, I will be a dictator on day one, he said. And Hannity's like, well, you don't really, he kind of owns it, and a lot of followers like that. So, I think we can set that aside as not being controversial. But what will happen in the Republican Party? Can there be Trumpism after Trump? Absolutely. At the current place we're at, sure. Again, my just reading of the zeitgeist, maybe I'm wrong, my reading of the zeitgeist is we are breaking, that there's a shift happening where, but one of the biggest problems has been that many Americans have been asleep. They don't realize what the stakes really are, that it really can happen here. In fact, it did happen here in the past. And it's taken a while for most people to kind of wake up to the threat. But I think it's starting to slowly percolate, and that there'll be a sea change as it does. But yeah, the threat's absolutely there. As long as one of our major political parties is down with authoritarianism, that after the Capitol was sacked and the members of Congress were almost themselves killed, they gathered again late at night, and a majority of the Republican caucus voted for the insurrection, essentially, in the vote. I mean, how is that even possible? The country needs two functioning parties working within the liberal democratic tradition. Like, things will be really bad, even if we have, let's say the Democrats start winning 80% of the vote in every election, and we only have one party, that will be really bad really quickly, because if you don't have political competition, the ruling party that dominates things will, become, unresponsive and abusive. You need the political competition. We need a healthy center-right party in this country, and there's lots of Burkean conservatives and Republicans out there who are saying that, but unfortunately right now they're a really small section of the Republican primary voter at the moment. But writ large though, you take Democrats, independents, non-aligned people, and Republicans, there's a supermajority of people who, when really asked, are not down for authoritarian ethno-nationalism. A lot of them don't realize that that's kind of what's on the menu, but most people don't want that. It's just people need to sort of like, time to wake up, everybody, right? And the media's role is to present the stakes to people. This is, in fact, the choice, which do you want? This guy's saying this is literally what he's saying and what it means, and not, mess around with it, because it's not just Coke versus Pepsi this time.
Hello, you can hear me, right? Yeah, I'm Sanjay Krishna. You can call me SK, and I'm a freshman. My question was, you said that media should do the work of like showcasing X so that thereby leading the public closer towards the truth. But like in a polarized society where the truth is really subjective and a lot of people agree with Trump's policy and don't really deem it as authoritarian, do you think media is forced to act in a way, in a non-partisan, neutral way, so as to be legitimate and considered in order to like, cover multiple perspectives and the rationale behind multiple reasons, so that that's why they're slow and like coping up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the media has to use the objective methodology to pursue the truth, and if that costs them, market or audience share, I mean, that's just their mission. You got to go for that. But if you're using objective methodology and, Democrats or Trump does something that's right, that his data is correct, or that the Republicans do, or the Democrats are doing something wrong, you're going to go cover that as well. The media can't wait to find Democratic scandals right now, right? Because it wants the balance. The whole machine's like, oh my God, we're out of balance. So they're desperate to find those things. Anytime they can, they'll do it. But that's kind of, you need the objective methodology where you're gathering the data and the evidence as it happens. But what you point to is, is the public, is truth able to win out over lies is a really good question right now. Because we've been talking about the mainstream media, as it's now called, those who are supposed to be tasked with trying to find the truth in some kind of objective way and share it. But now that operates in an ecosystem where their business model for most places is kind of destroyed. We're lucky we live in Maine, where our local, the newspapers that do all the weight of lifting and investigation in Maine are still alive and seem to be on a stable-ish footing. But across the country, the papers have died. The Des Moines Registers and St. Louis Post-Dispatches and Detroit Newses and the Oregonians of the world are, like tiny little tabloids with 3 pages in them and a bunch of AP. There's no news gathering going on in vast regions of the country, entire states, without that capacity. Little, nonprofits and web-based things are popping up and doing yeoman coverage, and that's terrific, but it doesn't replace the gathering ability that's been lost. So there's an absence of information outside the big national entities in a lot of parts of the country. And then if it still exists, right, the truth is paywalled. And for a lot of people, they're not going to subscribe to it. They can't afford to subscribe to it. It's just not what they do. The lies are free, right? There's entire entities even made to look like news sites that are free. Their whole job is to disseminate out into your social media things to tell you things that are completely made up sometimes. Not even a spin on things, but 2 + 2 = 5. And sometimes that's being done by a particular domestic political entity, sometimes it's being done by foreign adversaries, right? Or a troll farm in Macedonia where they're trying to sell widgets on the side. But whatever it is, that's a big problem where where is truth and how many people are able to distinguish truth from something made up is a very serious situation when the public square is no longer the public square, it's on our phones and is fed to us through algorithms and all the rest. So yes, those are all challenges. I still think that despite all that, the odds are on our side. But yes, those are all the many problems. And when I think about AI now generating photos and video and sending it out, I mean, it makes my head spin. But I still think that we will persevere, but we need to wake up.
Before we get to the next question, quick show of hands. How many of you believe or feel like you can trust mainstream media to give you objective information? Can you raise them a little higher? It's not a... Okay, so like maybe half, and the rest of you feel like do you trust it to be, I can't do a two-part because it's not going to work, but do you believe that you believe it's not objective or it's not true? You can shout that out. Not objective. Okay. All right, so
Yeah.
we got a thing.
I'm not saying that it's all being done well. I mean, if you get me criticizing some of the major outlets and I have got a long list of criticisms for them. But the model should be the objective methodology, and I see all kinds of problems,
Yeah.
The major outlets, I'll leave them unnamed now, for a decade, not covering climate change based on facts, always trying to find balance between them. Right? And you saw that in other spheres just now. There's all kinds of world events now that are minefields for any mass circulation papers to decide how to negotiate that. So, yeah, those are all,
It's
difficult
amazing.
spaces.
Yeah. All right, I saw a bunch of hands who, I think you were up next. Yeah, come on up and then we'll, 1, 2, 3.
Hi, I'm Aubrey. I'm also a first year. I noticed throughout your talk you kind of came back a lot to the idea of journalism not necessarily being able to keep up with what's going on now. And you talked about kind of caught in this old way of thinking and kind of the death of the small town newspaper. And we kind of saw with the brief survey we did, there's a lot of mistrust of news right now. My question for you is, how do you think journalism and the way we gather news, disseminate news, needs to change in order to keep up with the current political system?
Right. I mean, it needs to change in the way I'm describing, get to the objective methodology, chase it down, and not be afraid to report what you find, right? If you're the scientist, you've got the evidence, you've finally proven it, here's the answer. Whatever it is, you're not going to hide the answer or try to talk your way around what the numbers actually say, just go say it. But the other question is the fact that a lot of the journalism system is broken and nobody's out there, good or bad, able to do the journalism anymore. You need lots of that, right? You need lots of reporters out there. And we're not even talking like local papers. We're talking like statewide, dailies, like those major cities like St. Louis and Detroit and such don't have any real coverage. Can you imagine? States many times the size of Maine, and there's like no functioning state house coverage. You're not covering the legislature and the governor and your local congressional delegation. Better yet, your mayor or the town council or the planning board. Things that actually matter are just going completely unlooked at, which means the sunlight is the disinfectant is true. If the actors know nobody is looking, a lot worse stuff happens. There's even academic research on that, where the local paper dies, corruption goes up. There's like a direct relationship between those things. So those are problems. So we need a new business model, and everybody's been trying to figure out what it is. The old model died with the internet. The legacy news companies weren't able to figure out how to be Craigslist. They let Craigslist be Craigslist and lost all their classified ads and all their revenue. So what do you do now? It seems to me that in the end, journalism is a lousy business, especially in a competitive environment. Doing journalism well costs lots of money and doesn't get you as many readers as doing crappy journalism, right? The cheapest thing on earth to do is to wait on the police scanner and run out and stand in front of the fire trucks or the police, wherever they are. It costs nothing. You don't have to investigate anything. You just move your cameras there, and then you're done, or something salacious, or getting people to click things and pick your favorite cat or whatever it is. Those are the things that get you the most readers coming in, and they don't cost anything. So if journalism's a bad business proposition, and the actual purpose of journalism is sort of a mission rather than a business product, then maybe the model is going to need to be in that sort of non-profitish sphere where it's a public good, like a university or a college. Can't be, government funded, because I think, as the NPRs of the world and others discover, that can come with all kinds of encumbrances. But I think you need to start creating these nonprofit models, and most of the successful entities that are out there are like that. They may be selling ads and being nimble and trying to be businesses, but they're owned by a nonprofit, so in the end there's no shareholders, and their mission is to be good journalists and to use the advertising or the pay or the subscriptions or whatever they have to help pay for the journalism, but the journalism is the mission, not the balance sheets for whatever venture capital firm brought up your paper and plans to sell out all the real estate and send you away and throw away the wrapper when they get all the last profits out, which is what's happened to all those papers I just described. So yeah, we need a new model like that. I'm not a business person, so I'm not the expert on that, but I know that's the direction to go. The paper that I work with, the Press Herald, which also owns the Waterville Morning Sentinel and the Lewiston Papers and the Capital Journal in Augusta, is all now owned by a national nonprofit that stepped in, so it has that model now. And I think that's probably the road to better stability. Could have ended up completely differently with one of these rapacious entities that's just coming in to grab all the assets and sell them off and take them apart, which has happened elsewhere. So hopefully more of that, and there's a lot of startups. Mississippi Today, right? A newsroom created in Mississippi because no one was covering the State House in Mississippi. They created an online newsroom, gathered a bunch of journalists, got foundations and Knight Foundation to help fund it, and they just won the Pulitzer Prize last year for local reporting in the entire country, right? So you can do good stuff. When the Burlington Free Press died in Vermont, Vermont Digger rose up. But they're all much smaller than the legacy newsrooms. You have a newsroom of 20 replacing newsrooms of 200, right? 90% of your reporters aren't there, so you just can't cover everything. So, but we need to gear up that world of these, new and probably digitally native publications, but whose mission is the journalism, not some kind of profit and loss statement at the end of the year.
Well, super glad that the Colby Echo's here today. Okay. We had a couple, I think you were next, and then, yeah, right, okay.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm a freshman. You kind of just answered my question, but another question is, I know we've talked about the 30% number that the authoritarian power kind of comes to a head. Do you think there's a chance that Trump is elected and there isn't really an authoritarian power that comes into the government?
I hope so. I mean, if he's elected, I hope that is in fact the outcome. I think the odds are not good on that. It would also depend on other actors, right? We wouldn't be in an authoritarian moment, Trump or no, if you didn't have an entire political party that bowed to that, which is empowered. You need, anytime an authoritarian takes over a country, it's the normal standard legacy political elite that acquiesced in it, right? That happens over and over again. So if in a future thing, people are like, oh, we don't want to go down that path, there's all kinds of actors who could step up. There were actors who stepped up in 2016, right, in Georgia and elsewhere, and ordinary anonymous, election board people against great odds. Vice President Pence, right, was under pressure to violate the Constitution and block the election, and he didn't do it. And he paid a price for it. But those are people who acted at the right moment. And I would hope that, it would require a bunch of people to decide to do that if there are authoritarian orders and impulses. That there will be, I have no doubt, because Trump was doing that in his past term and he's promising to do it again. I'm sure that's going to be his impulse. The question is, are there people who say, no, we're really not going to go down that path or not? Let's hope so.
Hi, my name is Anvi. I'm a first year. I think we've already established here that at present our mainstream media is extremely profit-driven, which is, as a result affecting its objectivity. So building on that, to what extent do you think the constant media coverage of the Trump court cases are kind of like guiding it away from discussing notions of domestic authoritarianism? And I mean, we know that we know how the constant media coverage played out in 2016. We know the role it has in Trump's rise to power. So is the media making the same mistake as 2016 again, and how is it going to play out in this election season?
Excellent question. I mean, I think some of the media is making the same mistakes as 2016. I actually don't think, though, that the court case itself is a good example. I mean, Trump may use that as a spectacle to his own devices, but you can't not cover a former and perhaps future president of the United States is on criminal trial in a courtroom. I mean, that's just news, right? So you have to cover it. So I think, there's no question about that part of it. But like the CNN town hall that got the head of CNN fired, I mean, that's an example of doing it totally wrong. But maybe the Pavlovian response among media CEOs to what happened then, and in other situations, maybe they'll be a little smarter this time. I think in general, in the decision-making class, in 2016, they thought, that Trump was this joke sideshow that was going to get a lot of eyeballs, right? One of the papers, Vanity, somebody put him in the style section, like wouldn't cover him in the politics section. I can't remember who it was. But everyone knows that it's real now, right? So that's going to some extent, mitigate some of those things. And I also think that, part of the reason when I say my gut is 20-30% is that, I do think that the Trump show and novelty is kind of wearing off, even for people who like it. It's kind of the same, we saw this, season before. Season 5 looks an awful lot like season 4 and season 3, and I think that's, not helping with the enthusiasm.
Grace, what's coming up for you right now?
I have to be honest, I'm really interested in your research and understanding American, regional identities. And I'm thinking about it in terms of what you just talked about with the disappearance of local papers, and even state papers and newsrooms. So how should, since we have such a nationalized media, how should the media, navigate the fact that there are these regional identities, but they're reporting to a much broader audience?
Yeah, I mean, well, the most important media is your local and statewide entities wherever you live, right? Because that, not only might you have people covering events in Washington, but they're also going to be covering your senators and congresspeople, and more importantly, your legislatures and state laws and stuff that are going to impact your life much, much faster. I mean, a lot of the federal government's power is giving grants to the states to do stuff in education and transportation and all kinds of other things. The state houses and the governor's mansions, a lot of stuff happens there that's going to affect everybody's lives. So having those geared up as much as possible, and they're going to have their own regional identities. In some states, they're covering states that are riven between regions, so that complicates things. There's a reason that there's not a statewide paper in Ohio, for instance. There's Cincinnati, and there's Cleveland and Columbus, and never the twain shall meet, right? The Houston paper doesn't move into Dallas country, right? The San Antonio paper circulates in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, but it's hard to find the Houston Chronicle there, right? There's no statewide paper because the regions of Texas and the regions of Ohio are more profound, maybe even than the state's own identities. So the local news environment will naturally coalesce around these regional structures. What should the national papers do? I mean, when they parachute people into other places, they hopefully will understand and do their homework as to where they're parachuting in. You may see it when you see people come to Maine and from the New York Times, the Post are coming from afar, and some of it rings true and some of it you kind of tell doesn't, and they don't know the backstory of all the sources they're using and that kind of stuff sometimes. So I was a foreign correspondent. I was constantly being dropped in. I'm sure I screwed up all kinds of things while I was trying to do it. It's a hard task. But in the best model you have, in a perfect world, your New York Times, your Washington Post has people from the place where the bureau is who know the place up and down already, right? Hire the reporters who were at the St. Louis paper to cover St. Louis, who are Missourians and know all the characters and have the institutional memory, is the perfect model. So that's how you would hope it would be done.
Yeah, and given that we're seeing that it's not happening at the local level, I can see how there is the potential to do this at a national scale.
Yeah, and the national, the Washington Post and the New York Times are the two big Goliaths that are kind of trying to do coverage and film. And I think they're doing a good job at the national level at covering things. But yeah, there's only so far that they can spread their own forces, even though they're large newsrooms. And you'll see, you look at any appearance where Dean Baquette and Marty Barron, the past heads of the newsrooms of the Times and the Post, talk about. I was at an event down in New York where they were both speaking, and they were asked, what do you think is the greatest crisis facing American journalism today? And they both said, oh, absolutely the death of local news. They said, not only does that leave these news deserts that I was just talking about, but for them, selfishly, they suddenly don't have the eyes and ears of all those local papers that they can keep track of and decide what they want to cover, right? There's the sensory apparatus that they secondhand use to figure out what's happening in the country that they need to dispatch their reporters to, or tell their Chicago bureau to go to Minneapolis now or go to St. Cloud. They don't have that input, and it makes it much harder for them to cover the local stuff, even selfishly from on high. So yeah, that's broadly recognized within the news media industry at that elite level that this is a major crisis in the whole apparatus. Right, and democracy doesn't work without the public being informed, and if you can't be informed at all the levels of government below Washington, D.C., that's going to be a problem.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm Bryn. I'm a sophomore. It's such an honor to have you with us tonight, so thank you so much. Coming back to that 30% number, I think it's so alarming, but in that situation, because it's not unlikely at all, where do you see fault lines starting to open up? I know for people in my generation and probably like past generations, America is just this kind of forever idea, and now we're kind of realizing that's not the case. So and I guess this ties into the 11 different cultural identities too. Where do the first cracks start to form?
Yeah, I mean, when American Nations came out in 2011, there's an epilogue, a last chapter, kind of like the wrapping things up. And it was sort of, American Nations is a history, but it was looking forward, and it basically said, Americans have gotten very complacent that it will always be a stable country that will always hold together, but our country is more fragile than people think because of these regional cultures, and it's not impossible that given a bunch of external shocks, a series of terrorist attacks, because back then that was the big worry, or I cited a global airborne pandemic, and other things, that you could end up in a situation where in a time of danger, right, you have a sort of kind of martial law or some kind of emergency, and you got to tie everything down because, I don't know, people have been setting up, weapons of mass destruction in different cities. And you could see that backing out of that might get complicated, in some places resisting, and you create the tensions. And everyone said, no, that'll never happen in 2011. Everyone dismissed it. This is alarmist, this is crazy. The country has deep democratic traditions and none of that could happen. Nobody says that anymore, right? They all, come and realize that, in fact, it can happen here and that the country's not immutable. Again, I think we're going to hold it together, but the fact is we've got this fractured map. We're more structurally like Yugoslavia than we are like Japan, right? There's different regions. There's a history of civil war a long time ago, but there are big ideological ruptures. And the fissure marks, where would things break? They would shatter along the lines of those fissures, which cut through some states entirely, right? In general, there's sort of a south-north shattering in parts of the West, but it's not just state boundaries, and it doesn't just follow the arc of the former Confederacy. If you look at the map, it's a little bit more complicated. What would lead to that? We can't predict how you would end up in the worst case scenario where there's like sort of civil war and fracturing, but just imagine, right? If you had a reckless authoritarian president who doesn't care about setting up a potentially explosive situation, all it takes is, some permutation of an armed force sent lawfully by the federal government against an armed force set to block them lawfully to defend the Constitution by a state government, right? Both sides claiming to be acting in law and order in the Constitution, that the other is betraying it and treasonous, and all it takes is for that situation to be set up, and somehow somebody starts firing, and then you could, maybe you pull out of it, but maybe you don't. You don't want to ever be in that situation where you have those kind of norms violated. And you wouldn't normally in our country, right? That wouldn't come up. But I think if you think forward, is that a possible scenario? Sure, right? Again, I don't think we're there, but people shouldn't be complacent that this is the stakes that we face, and we don't want to go there, right? Time to tack back towards the democratic norms that make sure that those kind of things don't happen. So.
Any last question from the audience?
Hi, I'm Tommy. I'm a first year. So you mentioned kind of like what the mainstream media should do in their coverage of the 2024 election. That is like throw out neutrality and kind of make the public more aware of the dangers of another Trump presidency. But how does this ideal clash with the rising affect polarization and divisiveness that we see in America?
Right. Well, I mean, I think polarization, is a symptom, not a cause. I mean, people like to say, oh, the country's polarized, and that's our problem. no, we're polarized because you have the rise of an authoritarian movement and other people who feel that's a bad thing, and the polarization between those two positions is enormous. I mean, you can't get a bigger gulf than that. You bet we're polarized. You'd better be polarized if that's your choice there, right? So I don't think polarization is it. I think the efforts in which you shift the tide against undemocratic norms and actually start othering them and make it safer and safer for people who want to other them but don't dare. And there's a lot of them out there. There's a lot of them out there in the House Republican caucus and the House Senate caucus, among other places, who would like to say that but don't feel they dare, but peek their heads up and start saying it. Speaker Johnson, right? Speaker Johnson just helped save Ukraine. And that was not his position up until recently. I think he saw the intelligence briefings and other things, was realizing what the stakes are, and at the risk of his speakership, kind of turned on his allies to do the right thing in a global stage where the stakes were absolutely enormous. So, those moments give one hope. I wouldn't have guessed it. Speaker Johnson would have gone that way. He did. And I think if you just start shifting the tide, I think the snowball starts rolling where people have more permission to say what their real concerns are. I think a lot more people who are cowed, particularly on the Republican side of the fence, would start coming out. And that would be fantastic, right? You need, like I said, you need a center-right party in the country. Right?
I think we're almost at time. Grace, you get the honor of the last question if you'd like it.
Thank you. I'll take it. Okay. So, as students, how do we enter this media environment? I guess, what is your last advice for how we should proceed, given what you've talked about today? What should we look for in our media, and how should we consume media? And I guess any last advice?
Yeah, I mean, those who are interested in entering journalism, I mean, I'm now getting to be an older guy, so the universe that I entered into doesn't exist anymore. But I know that it's all work in progress, and it's going to be a very exciting time because lots of things are going to happen and are growing up, and lots of experiments. It's going to be a super exciting time in journalism. What's going to happen and which models are going to work and where, we don't know yet, but you'll all be in on this sort of, not even the ground floor, just kind of like the first step up from the ground floor where all this is happening, and there'll be amazing things to cover, and the stakes will be really high, and there's one of the most important and interesting jobs out there. So yeah, I would look to that. The legacy newsrooms that are still surviving do a lot of the heavy lifting, and all the new entities that are sparking up and appearing will be nimble and exciting places to go. And in a certain sense, just selfishly, if you're considering journalism, young reporters, I mean, unlike before, you have like any story out there is yours. Here, have an entire state. Like any story you find, it's going to be your exclusive because nobody else is looking. That was not the case before. Like you had to fight, like all the stories were covered and you had to go somehow dig to find. Now they're just like it'd be a candy store for important stories out there and would just be, super exciting. You feel like you're making a difference in that. So from a journalism side, that's it. From a what to read and stuff, I mean, yeah, you're all from a savvy generation who understands media, so I think you'll be okay just differentiating between something that's lying to you and totally made up and something that's real. I think you can all figure out. But work on your great-grandparents, help them out quick because, they're not so good at differentiating these different environments. So yeah, hope your older loved ones find their way to something that's at least trying to be objective and tell them the truth as the outlet understands it for all its flaws.
Well, thank you, Colin, so much. I want to thank everyone for great questions. To our audience online, thank you for joining us. And it's been an amazing night. And we'll close with that. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.